Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com and welcome to another week's tutorial. Now for this week's tutorial, the request was that I actually draw a three-headed dragon attacking a futuristic city, and that I have essentially a mothership trying to take on this three-headed dragon. So this was a really fun piece to do because it did include a landscape. And it had a bit more perspective in there, and it was, in general, it was a lot of fun to do. When I started off with this piece, the first thing I did is I obviously pulled up some reference material so that I would have a general idea of what I was going to include in this, always very important. And the second portion was I was actually looking at a lot of building reference material, but mainly ones that were already illustrated by other artists because it's more futuristic. Another important thing that I also had to work on is, as you can see, I'm currently actually working on a really rough layout to get a general idea of the composition. So by doing this, I save a lot of time. It's all in grayscale, so I'm not wasting too much time with color, but I'm able to work out the design elements I'm going to include in this illustration. So all of this is super important, and it simplifies my overall process. Now, I was experimenting with some rendering techniques that I was going to use in this. So I was actually looking at some other artists' works to see how I was actually going to put this together. Although I did like the other artists' pieces, I actually ended up using a slightly different version of rendering to mainly figure out the different planes, and once I had those planes in place, the rest of it came together a lot faster, which is why I went with this technique. This entire painting took about 5 hours to complete, start to finish, and it actually didn't take too long. Now, when I was doing this piece, I did alternate between two brushes. They were both very similar brushes. One was a side brush and one was an upright brush with a slight angle to this. Now, the reason why I was using those customized brushes I had made a while back is because they lead better for doing layout designs in general, because I'm able to get flatter renderings for these aspects, which is extremely important for showing perspective and really showing the rigidity of these buildings. So you'll notice that these buildings have very crisp lines, and that's because of the type of brush I was using. It was a very simplified brush. It didn't have too much added onto it, so it wasn't slowing down my computer. It was just doing what I needed it to do. Now, to keep everything consistent and to keep the overall look interesting, it was very important that I essentially work on the main buildings first, the largest buildings, before working on the smaller buildings. These buildings have to be more accurate perspective-wise because your eye is going to be automatically drawn to the information on these. But the nice thing about really working on that information first is that your eye automatically fills out the rest of the information for the smaller buildings surrounding these main buildings in the city. So by doing this, I save a lot of time, and I'm not wasting too much time while working on this piece. Once again, I have very limited amount of time, so I have to get this done correctly and quickly as well. I'm just working out the perspective a little bit more on this. And I'm just working on the foreground element right now. Now this building is going to be closer to the viewer, so I do have to add a little bit more information and make sure that the information does make sense. But I'm not overdoing the information once again, because this is a general landscape. I don't want to distract also from the main subject matter, which is the three-headed dragon. Now, the reason why I haven't worked on the three-headed dragon is because the dragon is further off in the background, and because of this, I won't have to add as much information. I can keep that portion much looser in comparison to the rest of the piece. Now, what I just did is I actually lowered the highlights, so the white balance in this image. it was too much in there, so everything looked too saturated, the color or the grayscale portion. It's better to leave the brightest whites until much later in the image, because by doing that you can show a lot more variety in your color tones. So because I am working everything out in grayscale first, I will be shortly using a color layer to start adding some color within the buildings. Now at the end of this video, you will actually notice that I did quite a bit of color editing after the recording process, just to help balance out the colors so that they work better together. Just adding the details in the mothership. Now this ship is closer once again to the viewer, so I have to add a lot more information. I also need to make sure that the information reads more clearly in comparison to the rest of the image. So what I just did right now is I started lighting up those background elements, and I'm going to start working on the ship designs next. Since I have the basic and most important elements that help frame the piece already completed, the rest of it is going to be much more simplified, so once again I don't have to add as much detail to it. Now I will switch between these minor portions of this image to the more focus areas, alternating between these two, and the reason why I'm doing that is I want to make sure I have a good balance for the overall piece. So right now I've started adding some of the additional details for the buildings, so I'm adding essentially or hinting at actual lights that are going on for these buildings in this painting. Once again, since this is further off in the distance, I don't have to add too much information for these lights. The eye will automatically assume that these are lights because of the way we're essentially brought up. We're surrounded by buildings that generally have lights in most cases. And because, once again, I'm going to insinuate the detail in the smaller buildings that are further off in the distance, I'm just essentially sampling some colors throughout and then just modifying those background elements, but I'm trying to keep the overall colors extremely light so that, once again, they look further off in the distance. Just adding some additional contours just to help show a bit more form for these buildings and a bit more highlights, and just fine-tuning some of those ship elements. You will see me actually adding some flame, essentially, because each of these had to have a different type of power. So I have one that's fire, then I also have one that's lightning, and one that's frost. So between all these aspects, I was able to come up with something that was actually really interesting. Now, I do want to show that the city is being defended from this threat. So you will actually see me add later on, once again, some lasers to help showcase that. So I've just started sampling in the colors that I already have in there for the dragon. And once again, I'm just keeping that super loose. And once I do start adding some stronger highlights, especially in the ship design, and from the flames essentially and the electricity coming out of their mouth, I'm going to bump up the highlights in their eyes as well. So I need to show the devastation, so I've added some smoke also in key areas to really help showcase that. So I just added the glowing eyes for this creature. Essentially, it needs to have a lot of power within it in order to be able to actually shoot these different elements. So for this reason, I need to show that, and the easiest way to show that is through the eyes, especially from this distance. So this is the final illustration. As you can see, I did quite a bit of color changes to really help make this piece work overall. And that's pretty much it. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next week. Thank you and take care.